April 8th, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. The cold at that altitude could freeze exposed skin in seconds. The sky was so clear it looked carved from glass, a deep blue that seemed almost solid in that brittle silence. The faint vibration of twin-row radials filled the cockpits of Focke-Wulf 190s belonging to Jagdgeschwader 26, the Luftwaffe's elite Western Front squadron, beneath their oxygen masks. Several German pilots were laughing, because high above occupied France, they thought the Americans had finally lost their minds. What they saw below were P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy, bloated machines that looked more like flying milk bottles than fighters. German pilots laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt. They really did. Though none of them could imagine that before the war was over, those same machines would rain 8 streams of half-inch bullets straight through their formations. Through the canopy glass, the Luftwaffe pilots watched the new American fighters struggle upward toward them, broad, barrel-shaped machines glinting under the morning sun. They looked absurd. "Die Amerikaner schicken uns fliegende Milchflaschen," one voice joked over the radio. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles." The laughter rippled across the channel. Easy, confident, unhurried. They had every reason to laugh. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had ruled Europe's skies. Its veterans had fought over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. They had seen every Allied fighter and beaten them all in turn. And now this, an overweight American newcomer, slow, clumsy, heavy, trying to climb into their domain. But what they did not know, what none of them could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would help destroy their air arm. The aircraft below them were Republic P-47Cs, the first Thunderbolts to see combat in Europe. Their engines, massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasps, strained under the 7-ton airframes as they clawed toward altitude. To German eyes, they looked like bombers pretending to be fighters. No one could imagine that within 18 months, these milk bottles would tear apart the Luftwaffe's finest formations, or that their arrival marked the beginning of a new kind of air war. From his cockpit, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken, a veteran ace, circled lazily above. His squadron had claimed dozens of kills in the past weeks. His instruments showed the Americans still climbing sluggishly below. "Clumsy beasts," he muttered. But even as he marked them, his eyes narrowed. Something about their formation looked disciplined. Their spacing was perfect, their climb steady. These weren't rookies flying blind. They were professionals testing something new down below in those ungainly machines. The Americans were feeling anything but confident. Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group, had transferred from RAF Spitfires just weeks earlier. He knew what the Germans were capable of and what his men were up against. The Thunderbolt was untested in combat. It was huge, temperamental, and in the hands of pilots still learning to master its weight. But Blakesley also knew something else. This airplane was built for a different kind of war. Unlike the nimble interceptors the Luftwaffe favored, the Thunderbolt was designed for altitude, endurance, and brute survivability. Its thick armor and massive radial engine could take damage that would disintegrate a Messerschmitt. Its 8 Browning machine guns could throw out 6,000 rounds per minute, a storm of lead powerful enough to saw an aircraft in half. The Germans that day couldn't know that the mathematics of destruction were already in those wings. Each Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition. In the space of 2 heartbeats, that firepower could shred anything in its path. But in April 1943, the Luftwaffe still laughed. They had survived everything so far. Why fear another Allied experiment? The radio crackled. "Achtung! They climb to meet us!" Hermeken's grin tightened. He pushed the throttle forward, his Focke-Wulf rolling inverted into a dive. Below, the Thunderbolts spread out, sunlight flashing across aluminum skins. The German formation swooped like hawks. Moments later, the sky over France erupted. The Luftwaffe opened the engagement with disciplined precision. And yet, for the first time in years, some of those attacks failed to finish their prey. The big Americans, though battered and slow, refused to fall easily. Their armor absorbed impacts. Some even turned toward the German fighters, guns flashing in reply. When the surviving pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 landed later that afternoon, they laughed again, but it was forced now, tinged with curiosity. "They fly like trucks," one said, But they do not die like trucks. They didn't know it yet. But that was the first crack in the confidence of the Luftwaffe. The age of the Thunderbolt had begun, and laughter would soon give way to disbelief. The laughter carried far beyond that first skirmish. In briefing rooms across northern France, Luftwaffe officers swapped stories about the new American fighter, tales of its size, its sluggish climb, its ungainly silhouette that seemed to defy every aerodynamic law they knew. "It looks like a beer keg with wings," one pilot scoffed, sketching its round fuselage on a chalkboard to a chorus of amusement. In the eyes of German aviators, men raised in the lineage of the Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf, the Thunderbolt was everything a fighter should not be. It was enormous, it was heavy, and it was loud. To them, agility and speed won dogfights, not armor and horsepower. Their sleek Bf-109s could climb faster, turn tighter, and dive with elegance. The new American machine looked like an industrial mistake, something built by engineers who had confused mass with power. And in the early weeks, the statistics seemed to prove them right. Throughout April and May of 1943, Thunderbolt squadrons lost aircraft faster than they could tally victories. The Luftwaffe's kill ratios remained high, and confidence filled every ready room. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2 called the P-47 meat for the slaughter. In a message to headquarters, Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, one of Germany's top aces, dismissed it completely. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a cow. Our boys call it Die Schwangere Kuh, the pregnant cow," but while the Germans mocked, American engineers back in England were quietly studying the wreckage of Thunderbolts that had returned home looking like sieves. They found aircraft with wings shredded by cannon shells, fuselages punctured by 20mm rounds, and engines peppered with shrapnel, yet somehow still flying, in one famous case. A P-47 limped back to base with 120 holes in its skin and half its control cables severed. Another came home missing an entire cylinder bank, the prop still turning on raw torque. The pilots who flew them began to trust their machines in a way that German pilots no longer could. For the Luftwaffe, attrition had begun to bite. Their pilots were experienced, but their numbers were shrinking. Replacement training lagged, fuel was limited, and mechanical wear on aircraft was accelerating. Yet they still saw themselves as masters of the sky. They had no reason to fear these overweight American curiosities, not yet. What they didn't realize was that the Thunderbolt wasn't meant to fight by their rules. It was designed for a new kind of war, a war of altitude, endurance and overwhelming firepower. In that difference lay its true strength, one that would soon turn laughter into disbelief. By early summer, that strength was about to reveal itself in the skies over northern France, June 1943. The war in the air had settled into a brutal rhythm, every day. Waves of American bombers, B-17s and B-24s, droned toward German industrial targets. Every day the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. And every day, the sky over Europe turned into a battlefield of vapor trails and burning aluminum. At first, the P-47's role seemed secondary, a short-range escort that could protect bombers only for the first leg of their journey before turning back for lack of fuel. German pilots knew exactly when to strike. The moment the Thunderbolts turned for home, the bombers were alone. For a time, it worked, but the Americans adapted fast. New drop tanks extended the Thunderbolts' reach deeper into occupied territory, and the pilots began learning how to exploit what their aircraft did best. Major Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group drilled it into every briefing. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them. Use your weight, use your power, use your guns. That philosophy changed everything. The P-47 wasn't built to dance. It was built to strike like a hammer. In a dive, it was unstoppable, from 30,000 feet. A Thunderbolt could exceed 500 miles an hour, faster than any German fighter in existence. Even the famed Focke-Wulf 190 would shudder and lose control long before reaching those speeds. The tactic that emerged became legendary. Boom and zoom. Climb high, strike fast, and dive out before the enemy could react. Then climb again and hit from above. It wasn't elegant, but it was devastating. On June 26, 1943, the Luftwaffe learned just how devastating. That day, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was attacked by 16 Focke-Wulfs, led by Wilhelm Galland. Brother of the famous Adolf Galland, Johnson's Thunderbolt was ripped apart by 21 cannon shells. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic lines burst, his leg bleeding from shrapnel. He tried to bail out, but the canopy had jammed. Trapped in a dying machine, he could only fly on. A German pilot moved in for the kill, emptying his guns into the crippled Thunderbolt, but the P-47 refused to die. It absorbed every hit, kept flying, and finally, unbelievably, crossed the Channel back to England. When Johnson landed, his ground crew counted more than 200 bullet holes. That event shocked both sides. For the Americans, it was a revelation, proof that their aircraft could endure what no other fighter could. For the Germans, it was a whisper of something they didn't want to believe. The Americans had built a monster that wouldn't quit. After that, even the mocking voices in the ready rooms began to fade. Reports reached Luftwaffe command describing P-47s that wouldn't fall no matter how much ammunition was spent. Pilots began to speak of them with wary respect, or quiet unease. By late summer, the flying barrel had stopped being a joke. The Germans still held the advantage in experience, but for the first time since the war began, they were facing an enemy whose machines were tougher, faster in a dive, and produced in numbers beyond comprehension. The American giant had arrived, and though the Luftwaffe didn't yet know it, the balance of the air war was beginning to tilt. Late June 1943, the air over northern France shimmered with heat from the summer sun far below. Columns of dust rose from the country roads as German convoys moved cautiously. Always scanning the skies, the Luftwaffe still flew with confidence. But something subtle had shifted, in ready rooms and operations tents. The laughter about the flying barrel had grown quieter. At their bases in occupied France, squadrons like Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2 began reporting encounters that didn't fit the pattern. The big American fighters were getting faster, their tactics sharper for the first time. German flight leaders noticed that their prey was beginning to adapt. On June 26th, that adaptation drew blood. The skies above Lisieux, France, were alive with vapor trails as 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 61st Fighter Squadron escorted bombers returning from a raid. The Luftwaffe struck with 16 Focke-Wulf 190s, veterans. Confident and lethal, they attacked from above, diving through the sun in perfect formation. In seconds, the sky became chaos. One Thunderbolt, flown by Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, caught the brunt of the assault. 21 cannon shells exploded across his fuselage. The canopy shattered, oil sprayed across the windscreen. The engine cowling was torn open, flames licking the front of the aircraft, wounded in the face and leg. Johnson reached for his canopy latch, but it wouldn't move. A cannon round had fused the rails. He was trapped. Below him, the English Channel glittered faintly in the distance. Ahead, the horizon shimmered like salvation. And behind him, another German fighter, flown by an unidentified pilot, slid neatly into firing position. The 20mm cannons erupted again. More holes, more fire. Yet still the P-47 held together. What followed became one of the most extraordinary moments of the air war. The German pilot, out of cannon shells, switched to his machine guns and kept firing. He emptied his belts. The Thunderbolt shook but refused to fall. As the American limped home at barely 170 miles an hour, the German pulled alongside through shattered glass. Johnson could see his face, young, incredulous, eyes wide with disbelief. The German raised his hand in salute and broke away, perhaps out of ammunition, perhaps out of sheer respect. That Thunderbolt made it back to England, leaking fuel and oil, its engine coughing itself to death on the runway at Manston. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after 200. The engineers who studied it later called it impossible. Any other aircraft would have disintegrated when news of Johnson's survival spread. It became an instant legend in American briefings. Pilots nodded in awe. In German ones, officers shook their heads. Intelligence dismissed the story as Allied propaganda, but witnesses from Jagdgeschwader 26 confirmed it. They had seen the impossible. For the Luftwaffe, that encounter marked the first uneasy realization that the enemy's new fighter could take punishment far beyond anything they'd faced. The Thunderbolt might not turn like a Spitfire or climb like a Messerschmitt, but it could dive like a falling anvil and come home riddled with holes. From that day on, When the Germans saw those stubby silhouettes rising toward them, laughter gave way to calculation. What altitude are they climbing to? How fast can they dive? How much ammunition do they carry? Questions they had never bothered to ask before. The Luftwaffe's dominance was beginning to crack, and within weeks the Thunderbolt would show the world exactly why. By July of 1943, German radio operators had begun using a new phrase when intercepting American transmissions. Achtung, die Achte. Beware the 8. It referred to the 8. 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in each wing of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Individually, each gun was deadly. Together, they formed a storm that could vaporize an aircraft in seconds. Each Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition, nearly 900 pounds of lead and brass. When all 8 guns fired in unison, they poured out 100 bullets every second. The shells met at a single convergence point roughly 300 yards ahead, creating what pilots called the cone of destruction. Anything inside it simply ceased to exist. For Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to brief, precise bursts from 20mm cannons, the American approach was terrifyingly different. The 50 caliber guns could sustain fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. German fighters, with limited ammunition, had to make every shot count. The Americans could afford to drown the sky in lead. The first to feel that difference were the twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s, the Luftwaffe's heavy destroyers, on August 17th. During the twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Major David Schilling led his flight of Thunderbolts in defense of the bomber stream. 8 Messerschmitts fell in under a minute. Survivors described the P-47s diving like hammers from heaven. One German gunner, captured later, said simply, "We fired, they did not stop, then they fired, and everything disappeared." Even seasoned Luftwaffe aces began to dread those flashing wings. Unlike earlier Allied fighters armed with rifle-caliber guns, the Thunderbolt's battery could shear a tail section off a 109 in 2 seconds. Franz Stigler, a German ace, noted in his diary that the new American firepower makes holes like fists. The psychological effect was profound. For the first time, German pilots found themselves second-guessing their attack runs. Do we dive? Do we engage head-on? Do we wait for them to turn? Each hesitation cost lives. Technically, the Thunderbolt's design amplified its lethality. The aircraft's thick wings provided stable firing platforms, its heavy frame absorbing recoil without losing accuracy. Its 8 guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude, and synchronized so that their tracers formed a single glowing river of light, what one Luftwaffe pilot later called a wall of fire. The Americans refined their tactics around this devastating advantage. Boom and zoom evolved into what the Germans came to call Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. P-47s would attack from altitude, roll inverted, and descend in near supersonic dives, unleashing torrents of gunfire before zooming back to safety. For the Luftwaffe, there was no defense against it. To outturn a P-47 was useless if the Thunderbolt never turned. To outclimb it was futile when it struck from above. All that remained was to pray you weren't caught in that convergence point. By late summer, one fact had become undeniable even to German intelligence. This was no clumsy brute. It was a predator disguised as a freight train, and its message was now clear. You can laugh at our plane, but you cannot survive it. The laughter that once filled Luftwaffe ready rooms had vanished, replaced by a quieter sound, the rhythmic whine of sirens as mechanics refueled and rearmed what few fighters Germany had left. The Thunderbolt had entered the war not as a beauty but as a beast, and soon it would become the sound that haunted every German pilot's dreams. The sound of thunder at 30,000 feet. Autumn 1943, across the occupied territories. Rumors spread through the Luftwaffe's airfields like wildfire. Mechanics swore they had seen American fighters land with holes big enough to crawl through. Pilots claimed to have watched P-47s spiral downward, trailing black smoke, only to see them level out and climb again. The Thunderbolt had acquired a new nickname among the Germans, Der Eiserne Hund, the Iron Dog. No matter how many times you kicked it, it refused to die. The secret lay buried in its heart. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, and a turbo supercharger system that turned exhaust into altitude. Where German engines gasped thin air above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolts kept breathing strong. In the stratosphere, it could still deliver sea-level power, propelling that 7-ton airframe faster than anything with a propeller had a right to go. German intelligence reports began to note the pattern. P-47s that should have fallen simply didn't. One reconnaissance officer in Abbeville wrote, "We put 20 shells into a single machine. It returned fire. We saw it later, landed safely. At first, High Command dismissed these accounts as exaggerations, but wreckage told the truth. Wrecked Thunderbolts showed structure built like bridgework, massive spars, armor around the engine and pilot, redundant control lines doubled through the fuselage. A machine built not for grace but for survival. American pilots were learning to trust that toughness. They dove into combat knowing the odds favored their machines. If hit, keep flying. If burning, dive to blow the flames out. The P-47 could take punishment and still bring its pilot home, a bond no German flyer could match. That invincibility began eroding German morale. Veteran ace Hans Philipp, with over 200 victories, learned this the hard way. On the 8th of October, 1943, he led a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s against a bomber stream near Bremen. High above, Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group waited. When they dived, Philipp's engines faltered in the thin air. His aircraft became prey. He never returned. The message spread quickly through every ready room. The Americans ruled the high altitudes now. The Focke-Wulf's BMW 801 engine simply couldn't keep up. The Luftwaffe's edge was slipping away, one altitude band at a time. And with every encounter, stories of those unstoppable engines grew to German ground troops. The roar of the P-47 became a sound distinct from any other. Deep, rolling, almost metallic, the growl of power that promised destruction. They called it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap by the year's end. What had begun as mockery had turned into grim respect. The Luftwaffe's veterans, once laughing at the flying milk bottle, now briefed their new recruits with a warning. If you see one of those big Americans above you, do not follow it into a dive. It will take you down and come back alone. Winter bled into spring, 1944. The air war over Europe was changing faster than any general staff could track. American bombers were striking deeper into Germany, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Hanover, and for the first time, they weren't alone for the whole journey. The Thunderbolt, once a short-range escort, now carried fuel tanks beneath its wings. Extending its reach beyond 1,000 miles, the effect was immediate. German formations that once waited for the bombers to turn back now found the escort still there, fresh, patient, circling like hawks. The sky that had been a battlefield was becoming something else entirely, an occupation. In March, Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, described an encounter near Hanover. "We laughed," he said later, "when we saw their fat silhouettes against the sun, 30 seconds later. We were burning," the Thunderbolts had learned to climb. With new paddle blade propellers, they bit the air harder, rising faster. When the Germans tried to disengage, the jugs followed all the way to 30,000 feet. Rall's comrade Schmidt vanished in a flash of flame. "They came down like an avalanche," Rall said. "Faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters. Their guns did not chatter, they roared. That roar was everywhere now. Allied pilots called it confidence. German soldiers called it doom, from Normandy's coast to the Ruhr Valley. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns swept rail lines. Convoys and airfields, its armor shrugged off ground fire. Its engine ignored damage that would cripple any Daimler-Benz. The Luftwaffe began to ration fuel, training, even ammunition, but nothing could ration fear. By June 6th, D-Day, the change was complete. More than 500 P-47s filled the air above the beaches, layer upon layer from sea level to 30,000 feet. German pilots who tried to reach the coast found themselves torn apart before they ever saw the invasion fleet. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, one of only 3 who made it through, recalled, "We climbed through cloud and sunlight and found a wall, Thunderbolts everywhere. We attacked, and they erased us. Below, German troops gave new names to the machines that strafed their columns. Some called them Fliegende Panzer, flying tanks. Others, simply the Hammers, the nickname fit, in that summer sky. The hammer fell without pause. By mid-1944, The Luftwaffe no longer owned the daylight. The skies had turned American, where once German pilots had laughed. Now they whispered warnings to each other before takeoff. If you hear the thunder before you see it, it's already too late. By late summer, 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer laughing. The jokes that had once filled briefing rooms had given way to quiet tension, the kind that hangs in the air before a storm. Veterans who had mocked the Americans now watched their formations dwindle with every mission. Pilots who had once scrawled victory tallies on their cockpits now marked the names of fallen friends. The Thunderbolt had become a nightmare that refused to go away. It was everywhere, above the clouds, behind the sun, diving out of nowhere. German pilots began describing the sound of its guns in strange, almost superstitious ways. One compared it to a typewriter of death, hammering faster than the mind could comprehend. Another said it was as if the sky itself had begun to tear. Psychologists within the Luftwaffe even recorded a new kind of stress disorder they called Jabo fever, fighter-bomber fever. It began with trembling hands, sleeplessness, and nausea whenever the distant drone of thunderbolts was heard. Soldiers on the ground learned the same dread. Convoys halted at midday. Tank crews refused to move without cloud cover. The Americans ruled the daylight, and daylight was when Germany's lifelines were cut to pieces. Every day, thunderbolts swept the roads and railways from Normandy to the Rhine. Each mission tore apart bridges, locomotives, and fuel convoys. Columns that had once moved in open formation now crawled from barn to barn, hiding beneath trees. One German officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "We now fight the weather as much as the enemy. The clouds are our only defense. To the Americans, these raids were routine. To the Germans, they were apocalypse in miniature. When the P-47s came, they came in silence at first. A dark speck against the sun, then the scream of a dive, then the roar of engines and the hellish chatter of 8 machine guns. 2 seconds later, the column below was gone. Oberst Hans von Luck, a panzer commander in Normandy, described it simply. They came in low. You could see the pilot's face. The rockets streaked in first, then the guns. A column of trucks disappeared. 20 vehicles gone in a heartbeat. It was not war, it was execution. From the air. Thunderbolt pilots called it the turkey shoot from the ground. German troops called it Himmelsblitz, lightning from heaven by autumn. The Thunderbolt was not just a fighter, it was an occupying force. The Luftwaffe's airfields were under constant attack. Aircraft were destroyed before they could even take off. New pilots, barely trained, faced swarms of American fighters whose engines outlasted every battle and whose factories replaced every loss. The transformation was complete. What had begun as laughter had become fear. What had begun as mockery had become myth. The Luftwaffe's proud tradition of aerial mastery was now haunted by one sound: the rolling thunder of an American engine approaching fast. Winter, 1944. Germany's cities burned under an endless sky of contrails. The Reich, once confident in its walls of flak and fighters, was now naked beneath the Allied storm. For the first time, the Thunderbolt crossed into German homeland airspace in strength, its wings heavy with bombs and rockets, its guns already warmed, rail yards at Ham. Refineries at Merseburg, airfields from Bonn to Kassel, all fell under the Jugs' shadow. The Germans called it Die Donnerschlag, the thunderclap, a sound that froze entire battalions. Each strafing run was a symphony of destruction. The dive siren of airflow, the roar of the engine, and then the hammering rhythm of 50 caliber fire tearing across steel and soil. Even hardened aces felt the helplessness, Major Gunther Josten of Jagdgeschwader 7 recalled. We rose to meet the bombers, but before we reached them, the Thunderbolts were upon us. They did not chase. They executed. 8 guns. Always 8. In those moments, German pilots understood what American doctrine meant. Air superiority through endurance and production. The Thunderbolt was not a duelist. It was an industrial weapon. It represented the assembly lines of Long Island and Indiana, where one was finished every hour, for every P-47 destroyed. 2 more arrived within days, for every pilot lost. 10 more graduated from schools untouched by war. In contrast, the Luftwaffe was bleeding out. Its best men were dead or grounded. Its fuel was vanishing. Its new pilots had fewer than 100 hours of total flight time, not enough to master the temperamental Messerschmitt or to survive against the American storm. By 1945, Germany's sky had become a hunting ground. The Thunderbolt prowled from dawn until dusk. Over the Rhine, it strafed trains, over Bavaria. It cracked open airfields, and over Berlin itself. It attacked anything that moved, trucks, horses, even bicycles. The fear of the jug became part of daily life. One Wehrmacht private wrote home, "We hear the thunder before we see it. The ground shakes. Then the sky opens with light and sound. You cannot run. You only wait." The Luftwaffe tried to fight back with new weapons, the Me-262 jet, the rocket-powered Me-163. But the numbers were hopeless. Jets could outrun Thunderbolts, but not take off under their fire again and again. P-47s caught them low and slow, turning Germany's technological marvels into smoking wreckage before they ever reached altitude. The irony was total 2 years earlier. German pilots had laughed at the Thunderbolt's bulk. Now they whispered its name as if it were fate itself. By the last months of the war, the P-47's roar echoed over every front. It was not elegant, it was not graceful, but it was relentless. A hammer that struck until there was nothing left to strike. And to the men who had once believed themselves invincible in the air, it carried a single, unspoken message. The thunder is coming. And it does not miss April. 1945, northern Germany, the war was dying. The fields near Hanover were littered with the husks of tanks and aircraft. The air heavy with smoke and spring mist. Across the ruined airstrips, the last remnants of the Luftwaffe waited for orders that would never come. Then in the distance came the sound, low at first. A vibration more than a noise, rising, rolling, unmistakable. It was not weather thunder. It was the Thunderbolt. They appeared over the horizon in formation. Engines pounding in perfect unison. The P-47 swept in low. Wings flashing in the sunlight, bombs fell first. Then came the staccato roar of 8 Browning machine guns, measured. Relentless, merciless, hangars exploded. Fuel trucks vanished in fire. The ground shook beneath the storm of lead. In minutes, the attack was over. The jugs banked away through the haze, engines fading toward the west on the ground below. The last German fighters burned quietly, the same fighters whose pilots had once laughed at those American machines. The Luftwaffe that had ruled Europe's skies was finished. Its airfields were graveyards, its squadrons reduced to buoys and wreckage. The Thunderbolt had become the final symbol of Allied inevitability, built in factories that never stopped, flown by pilots trained faster than the Germans could bury theirs. In 1943, German pilots had dismissed it as absurd, a flying barrel too big and heavy to fight. By 1945, they understood the truth. The P-47 had not been designed to dance, but to endure. What looked like clumsiness was armor. What seemed wasteful was strength. It was the brute logic of industry turned into air power. Across Germany, the evidence lay in ruins. Over the Rhine, Thunderbolts tore apart columns of trucks and tanks over Bavaria. They shredded locomotives and rail lines over Berlin. They hunted anything that moved, even bicycles on empty roads. The Germans called it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. You could hear them long before you saw them, a deep metallic growl that grew into a roar, followed by the sound of the sky itself being ripped open. A 2-second burst could erase a train. And each squadron left behind miles of scorched earth. By war's end, Thunderbolts had destroyed over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and tens of thousands of vehicles. No other aircraft in Europe inflicted such devastation. German pilots who survived these encounters spoke of disbelief. They had fired everything, cannon shells, rockets, entire belts of ammunition, and the Thunderbolts kept flying. Engineers who examined wrecks afterward marveled at their construction. Doubled control cables, heavy armor, steel bracing, a radial engine that could lose cylinders and still run. It was overbuilt, overpowered, and indestructible. The very traits they had mocked, its size, its weight, its bulk, had become its greatest weapons. It could not outturn a Messerschmitt, but it could outdive, outgun, and outlast one every time. By the spring of 1945, even the Luftwaffe's high command acknowledged the inevitable. Their finest aces were gone, their fuel reserves empty. their new pilots sent aloft with barely 100 hours of training. Against them stood an air force that could replace every loss before sundown. The Thunderbolt had become a force of nature, heavy, implacable, and unrelenting. German troops came to fear not just its presence, but its sound. They said the ground trembled when its engines passed overhead, that the air turned metallic before the guns opened up. It was no longer a weapon of battle, but of dominance. When victory came that May, the skies fell silent across the ruined airfields of the Reich. The broad-winged silhouettes of captured Thunderbolts stood among the wrecks of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. To those who had once ridiculed them, the sight carried bitter irony. The flying milk bottle had outlived them all. The laughter of 1943 had turned to silence in 1945, the silence of defeat and reluctant respect. In the years that followed, surviving Luftwaffe pilots would remember the P-47 more than any other enemy aircraft. They admired the Spitfire's beauty and feared the Mustang's range. But they spoke of the Thunderbolt with something closer to awe. They remembered how it refused to die, how it dove like a stone from heaven, how its 8 guns cut through the air like the wrath of industry itself. For them, the Jug was not a fighter. It was a machine of judgment. The statistics only confirmed what experience had already taught. The Luftwaffe had lost 28,000 pilots in the West. Thousands of those deaths came at the hands of Thunderbolts, whose kill ratio ranked among the highest of the war. And for every P-47 destroyed, American factories produced 2 more. The Thunderbolt was the embodiment of a truth the Luftwaffe had refused to see, that in modern war, it was not precision or agility that triumphed, but production, endurance, and firepower. The irony could not have been sharper. Germany's aces had mocked the American fighter for everything it represented, its size, its excess, its brute force. But those very qualities had decided the air war in less than 2 years. The plane they laughed at had buried their air force under an avalanche of lead and smoke. The P-47 had not only destroyed their aircraft, it had destroyed their confidence. When historians look back, the Thunderbolt stands apart, the heaviest, loudest, and toughest single-engine fighter ever built. It was not beautiful, it was not graceful, but it was unstoppable. It flew into storms of flak, took hits that would kill any other plane, and kept going until its guns fell silent. It did not win through elegance, but through endurance. It was the hammer that beat the Luftwaffe into silence. In 1943, German pilots laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt. By 1945, there were few left to laugh. The Jugs 8 Brownings had done their work. Raining down fire until the laughter turned to ash, the thunder had spoken. The war in the air was over, and the sky belonged to the machine no one had believed in.